The intention for this video is to describe the panel configuration of a basic trucks and loaders panel. So the trucks and loaders panel tends to form a pretty central part of most control rooms because it tracks the operations of both the trucks and the loaders, and it tends to just be a pretty busy part of most operations. So in terms of event count, you tend to get a lot of truck and loader actions happening throughout the shift. Whereas a drill may drop off for several hours with no new information coming through, depending on communications and so on. So to configure all panels in Pitram, we have this little hand pointing at a piece of paper button, and basically what this lets us do is define the characteristics of this panel. So the first option we have is the name. The next one is source locations. Now, this is a kind of grouping where it'll only show us loaders that are assigned to the locations within this section. So right now I've got this set to all locations. What this means is I'm going to see every loader that's defined at all locations here. So if I was to change this and just include the pits, what we should see is this excavator 3, which is assigned to the surface ore stockpile, should disappear because it's no longer at a source location that is valid. Now that's a really useful example because that's basically the logic that the rest of the panel uses to determine what is and isn't shown. That disappeared because it's no longer on this source locations list where it was assigned. The exact same concept applies to loading units. So right now, all of my surface loaders have been selected using equipment group. But if I was to change that and individually select loader or excavator 2 as my only valid loading unit, then excavator 1 is going to disappear. Now, you can use this sort of thing to define really anything. I mean, a common example would be having, a panel to track the performance and actions of your underground loaders, and then having a separate panel to track the performance and operation of your surface loaders. Or if you have different mine areas that are separated from each other, and you want to separate out the loading units because there's a huge geographical distance between them, and it makes sense to do so, then that's something that you could do as well. So we've gone through that one. That's our source locations and our loading units. Hauling units is the exact same concept. Right now we have all surface trucks being selected. If I wanted to individually only show the actions of these trucks, I would move them over to the list and it would filter out everything that isn't these 4 trucks. I'm not going to do that in this case, but that's how it works. The dump locations displayed in the dialog. This section will control what locations appear when you mouse over and drag a truck up to this little box here. So right now I've got all locations, but if I wanted to select an active list or an individual location, I would move that over to there. Dump locations displayed individually shows these little boxes here. So right now I have ROM, which is why ROM appears here. Surface ore stockpile appears here. Waste stockpile appears here. Get rid of waste stockpile in this instance just so that we can watch it disappear. Material works the same way as the source location did. So if I was to select, in this case, low grade, and then I save the settings, this excavator would disappear because he does not have low grade assigned, and we would basically be filtering him out of the panel. I'm not going to do that because then we would have no excavators left. So go back onto all material. This one controls when you enter the measure effectively. So I have it set to measure and then dump, so it'll ask me for my measure input, and then it will dump the ore. This is the opposite of that, so it'll ask for the location and then the measure. This is measure then location. This section will control what cycle statuses appear. So right now I have my basic cycle statuses set up. If I wanted to remove, say, queuing at the loader, because in my operation, queuing at loader isn't something that happens, although that would be rare, I would get rid of it here. In this case, I'm going to select both of these, so we should have a new cycle status that will appear when we finish configuring the panel. The display measure determines what measure is shown on the for example, this section. It generally makes the most sense to leave this on ton, since most Pitram systems will convert loader buckets or truck dumps to tons anyway. So this is generally one of the options that makes the most sense. The loader dump measure determines what measure is used when the loader makes a direct movement that bypasses the truck. So for example, when I drag this excavator 2 and he makes a jump directly to the surface or stockpile. This is more common with a surface-based trucks and loaders panel, but it's not limited to that at all. If you've got a loader that's making a movement from a stope to a stockpile without any interaction with a truck, this is basically controlling the measure that he's going to use for that individual movement. Loader bucket makes a lot of sense. Most sites are probably going to see something along the lines of loader bucket in here, although it may have a slightly different name. A secondary loader dump measure is basically, rather than just loader bucket appearing when the loader makes that direct movement, you'll have a second option. So now when I drag my loader to the location directly, I'll see loader bucket as well as tons, so I can choose which one I enter. The truck measure controls what measure appears when I drag my truck over and dump his load. So right now it's using truck dump. If I wanted to use a weighbridge, I might have a measure here called weighbridge tons, or just tons, and then I enter my number that comes directly off the weighbridge. In this case, I'm going to leave it on truck dump. But it's the same concept as with the loader buckets versus tons versus load right, or whatever you want to use in that case. Again, secondary dump measure. It may vary based on what you're tracking. If you're tracking direct tons versus a truck dump versus two different types of trucks that have a different measure potentially, it's an entirely optional field though. This controls whether or not you want to see a pop-up basically, or whether you want that to be automatically credited. So if I got rid of these, it would just use my measure entry straight away. So for example, if I was using truck dumps and I dragged my truck over to my ROM to dump it, it would just credit 1 without asking me anything, but I'd like it to ask me, so I'm going to leave these activated. This is another filtering option, basically status-based filtering. So if I only wanted to see my loaders that were actually operating, then I would select this configuration. In this case, I want to see all status types. This section just allows us to define a default role. If you were using a detailed role setup in your system, like maybe you had a role specifically for loader operators and trucks, you could set that up here using default roles. I'm just going to leave this default for now. And that's effectively it. This is automatically picking up the location based on the last dump location. I'm not going to set that up in this case. The trucks and loaders panel in terms of configuration is probably one of the more complex panels, just because you have a huge number of options that are available. But those general concepts that I've just outlined in terms of filtering, they apply to all panels within Pitram. If I find another example, even just a timeline panel, you'll see these effectively the same options, maybe presented slightly differently, but you know, equipment. Select the equipment, the feature inside that panel. That's really a one-on-one on panel configuration, not just trucks and loaders. It's going to cover the configuration of basically every panel that you could imagine in Pitram. So quite a useful lesson.